You guys out there? Oh, hi, class. So, audio lecture number 2, part 1. So, when we left off in our last lecture, it seemed to many like the world was falling apart. Having just experienced a civil war fought over slavery, race, it now seemed to some Americans that we were moving towards a new civil war, but now along class lines. And it's true, the years after 1877, the Great Strike, did see increased labor strife, increased conflicts between labor management, increasingly violent strikes. We enter the 1890s, a period of another depression. We'll talk about that more in a future lecture. The worst depression America had ever faced, in fact, and increased labor strife, violence, conflict. It seemed to some that America was on the verge, at the end of the 19th century, on the verge of Armageddon, of a conflict of biblical proportions. But as we saw in the last lecture too, these conflicts are in many ways generated by the fact that Americans were being brought together in new kinds of ways and new kinds of unities that had not existed in the years before the Civil War were arising during these years. The forces of for the word for today's lecture, incorporation. The forces of incorporation were just as strong, if not stronger, than the forces of conflict in the 1890s. And so a decade that on the surface seemed to Americans like a period of intensified conflict was actually a period of incorporation. Incorporation will take many different forms during this time, but understand incorporation literally just means bringing people together, connecting people, connecting Americans in new kinds of ways, making possible a sense of national experience and national identity that we take for granted today. These forces are not originating as much as hastening in the 1890s. And so we need to consider some of these forces of incorporation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you guys like going to Cedar Point or Disney World or Disneyland, understand that that all begins in Coney Island in 1890s. The rise of a mass culture, mass entertainment, literally an entertainment for the masses of Americans. Coney Island, one of our first great centers of amusement park entertainment, is emerging during these years, connecting Americans in ways that again we take for granted today. You're born into a mass media, mass culture, mass entertainment saturated time with, well, we moved beyond radio and television, although they're still there, but we're into streaming, social media, all these things that make possible kind of mass identity and mass connections, connecting Americans. And yes, it's true, especially social media. It feels like it's an incredibly divisive feature, but we need to consider the ways in which it's connecting Americans first before it's dividing us. And this was the same all the way back in the 1890s with the emergence of mass culture. Ragtime, featured by Scott Joplin, the pianist, is part of this movement towards a mass culture, but Coney Island too, a place you need to go to. But that's not what we want to focus on today. Coney Island's still there, that kind of old mass culture is still there, but the incorporation I want to focus on immediately for this first part of the lecture is the rise of a corporate economy, and particularly a large corporate economy. Now, we've been seeing this in the previous lecture with the rise of the railroads, America's first large private corporations. But the size and the scale of these corporations will just rapidly increase in years after the railroad. Of course, these are the guys that you learned about in your high school classes. J.P. Morgan with banking, Andrew Carnegie with U.S. Steel. I talked a little bit about in the previous lecture, but you probably came across the name John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil. So Rockefeller started buying up oil refineries in the 1860s. Oil the discovery of oil in the United States, 1859, Titusville, Pennsylvania, suck it, Texas. Pennsylvania is where Texas has a little bit more oil than Pennsylvania, but we find it first in Pennsylvania. The thing about oil production, it's if you've ever seen the movie There Will Be Blood, it's just a nasty, rough business. Rockefeller said, I don't want anything with that. Whoever finds oil, wherever they find the oil, bring it to me. I want to refine it. That's how I'm going to kind of make my fortune. So Rockefeller, relying upon money he'd gotten from his father, I forget what his father had done, but he begins the process of buying up oil refineries. I think by 1870, Rockefeller owns about 10% of oil refining within the United States. 20 years later, John Rockefeller and his Standard Oil controls 90% of oil refining in the United States. It's the monopoly of monopolies. Microsoft, Walmart today, Amazon, it's nothing compared to the corner in the market that Standard Oil enjoyed. Our first great and in many ways largest monopoly ever in American history. How do you do it? Well, some questionable practices, frankly. I mean, just to mention a couple of these. When you are big, you can get privileges, advantages that others can't. One of the privileges Rockefeller was able to work out during these years with the railroads. So Rockefeller could go to, the B&O Railroad or the Reading Railroad and say, hey, I'm going to have a guaranteed shipment of product on your rail line. I want you to give me a discount on your freight rate. I want you to charge me less than what you're going to charge my competitors, because you're going to be getting a standard shipment from us, right? It's Standard Oil. You're going to be getting a regular flow of product from us. Railroad said, okay. And then Rockefeller says, I want more than that. When my competitors ship on your lines, whatever you want to charge them, I want a cut of that. So Rockefeller goes beyond just getting a discounted rate on the railroads. He actually gets some of his competitors' money going to him through the middleman of the railroad. Was this legal? At the time, yeah, there's not regulation on this kind of thing. Was it considered to be unpopular? Did it kind of solidify Rockefeller's reputation as a robber baron? Absolutely. When Ida B. Tarbell finally released her journalism on what Standard Oil was doing, it included these kinds of, underhanded kickbacks. It made Rockefeller pretty unpopular, and we'll see how it gets Rockefeller into trouble, but also into one of the wealthiest Americans that ever lived. But that's in a future lecture. So that's one thing that he did. Hostile takeovers was another. When you're big, you can buy out your competitors and become bigger. Rockefeller would decide that he wanted to, destroy the oil refinery. He wanted to buy up the oil refineries in Florida, for instance, one of his competitors. I don't know if there were oil refining in Florida, but let's just hypothetically say there was in Florida. So Rockefeller could send his agents into Florida and start flooding Florida's market with Standard Oil that is well under market value. He could undersell his competitors there in Florida. And suddenly, Floridians start buying all their oil. I should say, what were they buying oil from? Primarily in the form of kerosene, about 55. Sorry, I don't know. Actually, that's how much we exported to other countries. Yeah, try to imagine a time in which America was exporting oil to other countries. We're actually doing it today, so it's actually a lot easier to imagine. But when I first started doing this lecture about 15 years ago, it was unthinkable that America would ever be exporting things like oil and natural gas. We're back into one of those times. Thank you, fracking. But at this time, we exported a lot of our oil products primarily in the form of kerosene. You needed kerosene to fuel lamps. How was lighting done during this time at home? Primarily through kerosene lamps, and so people bought this Standard Oil. So Floridians are buying up Standard Oil instead of from the Florida refineries. Some of these Florida refineries are in a desperate situation, right? They're getting undersold by Standard Oil. Then comes a knock on their door. Hi, we're Standard Oil. I would like to buy you guys out. What choice do you have? You can't keep taking a loss like this. And so Standard Oil buys those companies out. They become a part of Standard Oil. And this is how Standard Oil, in 20 years, goes from owning 10% of refining in the United States to 90% of refining in the United States through a kind of hostile takeover. Sorry. Text to landline. Who knew? This is kind of Rockefeller's thought about this whole business of consolidation, growth of large corporations. The growth of a large business is merely the survival of the fittest. The American Beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which brings cheer to its beholder only by sacrificing the early buds which grow up around it. In this case, the American Beauty rose is Standard Oil, and see that it is produced by the sacrificing of those early buds. What are those early buds? It's all of Rockefeller's competitors, which he destroyed through railroad practices and through hostile takeovers, flooding markets with cheap Standard Oil that then he could then increase the price on once he controlled that particular market. Are monopolies American? Is consolidation of economic power? We know consolidation of political power. But we fought a revolution against that. We fought a revolution against tyranny and monarchy, right? Is economic power and centralization of economic power as dangerous as consolidation of political power? Many Americans at the time said yes, and that's why people like Rockefeller were known as the robber barons. But understand what this is doing to our economy. In terms of this, we're seeing, and again, remember the theme of our lecture today is incorporation. We're seeing the rise of a large corporate economy of these large businesses that increasingly control and shape America's economy. So you have standardization in Standard Oil, standardization of production, right? One of the arguments that Rockefeller would make for consolidation, for a single producer of kerosene, of a Standard Oil, is that this makes for efficiency. It makes for a quality standard. It's easier to, it's just easier. And with this too, lower costs. Standard production, standard single production can end in lower costs. So Rockefeller sees all kinds of advantages, not just for himself, obviously, but for Americans too, in having a single producer of oil, in the way that some Americans were saying, well, isn't it better to have just kind of one or have few railroad companies or one railroad company overseeing all the railroads? Doesn't that make for efficiency? Doesn't that make for standardization, which is ultimately good, not just for the owners themselves, but for the customers? This is Rockefeller's argument. So production is standardized, centralized in this. And this is happening in other parts of the American economy as well. Centralization of production. I wouldn't exactly call Standard Oil a form of mass production, although we are very quickly on the cusp of mass production by the 1890s. Cigarettes and bicycles actually were considered to be some of our first mass-producing industries. I think by Rockefeller's time, we are producing about 12,000 cigarettes a day. Pretty impressive total, and Americans like to smoke. And we're still about 15, 20 years out, though, from, well, you guys maybe have heard of Henry Ford and Detroit and Ford Motor Company and the assembly line production. We're about 10, 15 years from that. But bicycles, cigarettes, Standard Oil, they're getting us there towards centralization and movement towards mass production. Rockefeller's company is also in standardizing production. Other things have to happen. Standardization of not just production in this case, but standardization of management. of managing this. And so Rockefeller's company is developing, in many ways, America's first kind of corporate culture. Understand, for Rockefeller, as he's building up his business, and he needs more people to kind of manage this distribution of Standard Oil products. There is no like management class. There is no how to do corporate culture for dummies. There's no book like that. Rockefeller, in other of the large corporate executives, they're writing these manuals. And as they are building these corporations, they're also producing a new kind of American worker, the so-called white collars. The white collar worker. It's estimated by 1900 that roughly 17% of the American workforce were white collar workers. This can include everything from secretaries to what we would call today low-level, mid-level managers. All these different kinds of positions we're familiar with today. These are starting to form here in the 1890s because they're needed to make something like a Rockefeller corporation possible. I think Rockefeller has, by 1890, when he's achieved this 90% standardization of oil refining, he's got about 100,000 employees at this time. But other companies are following suit as they're increasing in size. They're increasing this new kind of worker, these kinds of middle workers, right? They're not the so-called blue-collar workers like the railroad workers, the miners, the steel producers, the people who are actually like producing the stuff. The white collars aren't that, but they aren't the owners making the decisions either. There's these kind of middle, middle class, kind of in between class kind of workers that are emerging during these years as well too. And these are the guys who will go on to write the how to do management for dummies, how to do marketing for dummies. So you have standardization of production, standardization of management and oversight during these years as well too. But we will also begin to see the standardization or the centralization of consumption, the standardization of marketing, the standardization of producing during these years. We see the rise. I mean, have you ever been in a Walmart or been in a Target and said to yourself, where did this come from? When did this start? Where can we trace this back to? Well, we can trace it back to this period of history and the rise of what Americans called the big store. If you have centralization of production in Standard Oil, you have standardization of distribution, standardization of selling, of marketing, in the rise of these big stores. So your present day Walmarts and Targets and Myers have their roots in the 1870s and 1880s in what Americans called the big stores. Your Amazons have their roots in companies emerging during this time like J.C. Penney's. Now, you couldn't go online and look at what J.C. Penney had during these years, but you could get a J.C. Penney catalog in the mail, and you could thumb through and see what you want, and could order through the store that way. You didn't necessarily have to go to a J.C. Penney store. You could order out of their catalog. So even your Amazons are kind of rooting in these years. But really, when Americans talked about the big store, they didn't so much talk about Sears or Penney's with these catalogs. They're talking about the literal big stores in American cities. They're talking about Macy's in New York. They're talking about what was once Marshall Fields in Chicago. Of course, it's not Marshall Fields anymore. Macy's bought them out. There is no more Marshall Fields. Although it's nice if you go to Macy's in Chicago today, if you walk around the building, you'll see the old metal placards marking that this was once Marshall Fields. It's nice. As a historian, I like that kind of recognition to the past. Not everything was always Macy's at once there was a Marshall Fields, but these larger stores are emerging during these times. And the story that I want to focus on In Philadelphia, you had Wanamaker's. And I asked students, nobody's ever heard of Wanamaker's. It's because many students want to go to Philadelphia, honestly. I love Philly, the city of brotherly shove. It's where my family went on vacations. We go down and watch Phillies games. And so I love Philadelphia, but not too many people from the Midwest do. But if you ever have a chance to go to Philadelphia, particularly Center City, Philadelphia, make sure you stop by Wanamaker's, which today is not Wanamaker's anymore. It is Macy's as well, too. Right? This is what corporations do. They take each other over when they can. But there still are markers there. It's the old Wanamaker's building, but that's not the original Wanamaker's building. I don't want to say John Wanamaker was the originator of the big store idea, but he does have one of the first ones. And so let's take a little bit of a deep dive into it. Wanamaker's gets his start as a seller of men's clothing. He is selling to the Army during the Civil War, and I'm going to say makes a killing, but that would be in poor taste, so I won't do that. Wanamaker has a nice profit, and he's wondering after the Civil War, what do I do? What do I invest this money in? This is what you're supposed to do with capitalism, right? You're supposed to take that capital, that excess income you have, and invest it in order to increase wealth. So Wanamaker is wondering what to do. He says, I want to go big. I want to get bigger. So Wanamaker's will, in 1876, buy the Grand Depot. That's the lower left-hand picture that you're seeing there. It's an old train station. Wanamaker's buys it out, and this is going to be his first Wanamaker's department store. Wanamaker's is innovating in retail in many different ways. Of course, what is the big store at its heart? It's a store that consolidates retail, consolidates products for people to be able to sell. It's your one-stop shopping kind of idea. Wanamaker's and Marshall Fields and the Macy brothers, they're originating this idea back here in the post-Civil War period. So Wanamaker's is going to have men's clothes, but women's clothes too, and children's clothes, and accessories and beauty products, and whatever he thought there could be a market for, or something that he could market. He's going to bring all of these things into one place. What was shopping? What was the experience of shopping like at this time? For the majority of Americans, it was you go to this mom and pop shop to get this, then you go to this mom and pop shop to get this, and then you go to this store, and then you go to this store, and maybe for you to do your errands that day, you've gone to 7 different locations. Wanamaker says, wouldn't it be nice if everybody could come to just one location? And so that is what he was trying to pioneer for Philadelphians in 1876, one of the first big stores to make shopping more efficient for Americans, at least for Philadelphians, to come in. But he's innovating in other ways too. We know that what draws people to malls or to other big stores is not just the products that are there, but the experience of being there. And Wanamaker's understood he needed to create an experience to bring people in and to give them pleasant experiences of being in his store. So some of the firsts, the first restaurant in a retail store is in Wanamaker's. The first electric lights. I think one of the Wanamaker's might have been the first building with electric lights in Philadelphia. Understand, and we'll see. We'll see if you guys are paying attention enough. Electric lighting in public was new during this time. It was such a novelty. It was such an exciting thing that when the people might be out on a boardwalk or out at night and the lights would come on, they'd stop. They'd literally clap for the lights to come on. In our normal face-to-face class, I could teach you this in person. We'll see whether you pick it up through the audio lectures or not. I'll see whether you guys are paying attention. But you clap when those lights come on. Okay? So electric lighting, a novelty for people to experience, but also really good because it means that Wanamaker's can keep his department store open later. He can have longer hours for shopping because of this. The first elevator in Philadelphia is in Wanamaker's department store. The experience of riding an elevator, not one that we too impressed with today, unless we're taking one of those high-speed elevators up to the Empire State Building or something. But at the time, pretty cool. The first telephone in Philadelphia is in Wanamaker's department store. So a lot of firsts in here. And Wanamaker's is also pioneering a number of retailing firsts as well, too. You've heard that phrase, sorry. You've heard that phrase, the customer is always right. As best as we know, Wanamaker's coined that phrase. Whether he did or not, he certainly practiced it. Wanamaker had a liberal return policy. This is kind of new. The idea that you could, buy a dress, go home, take it, try it on. You didn't like it, you could return it to the store. This is something that Wanamaker's is pioneering. The kind of things we take for granted at a Walmart or Target today, that we can just return pretty much anything except electronics without a lot of fuss. They're not even going to ask us really why we're returning it. This is something that's happening with Wanamaker's during this time. Everyday low prices. That didn't begin with Walmart. It began with Wanamaker. This was an extension he would say this was an extension of his Christianity. Wanamaker's was a devout Christian, a disciple of Dwight Moody, the great evangelist of this period. Wanamaker's actually toyed with becoming an evangelist himself. He decided to stick it out as a businessman, but he wanted to offer, he would say, look, Jesus makes his salvation for free. I can't make my clothes for free, but I can offer them at a lower cost, right? I can offer them at a cost that more than just the upper classes or even the white collars can come and shop here. I want to have low prices so that all Americans can not just experience Wanamaker's store, but actually purchase stuff in Wanamaker's store too. Of course, this sounds good. Oh, what a great Christian! But of course, we know as well too what Walmart knows is the more volume. Lowering prices means going to increase your volume. Means you're going to have steady profit through that increased volume because of your low costs. So this makes good business sense well too. While he could also say that, hey, I am helping Americans be able to afford a better standard of living through my low prices. Ultimately, you put all these things together, and what are people like the Wanamakers and Marshall Fields and the Macy brothers, what are they doing in the 1890s? They're producing a new kind of capitalism, consumer capitalism. Understand the great question of the 19th century, the 1800s. Great question. The 19th century is, how do we produce more stuff? How do we get better at producing? By 1890s, Americans had pretty much figured out. As I said, we are on the cusp of mass production. Mass production requires mass consumption. And so the question for the 20th century, and people like Wanamaker's are understanding this, is how do we get better at selling stuff? We figured out how to produce more stuff now. How do we figure out how to sell more stuff? How do we figure out how to distribute this stuff? And so more centralized, efficient, standardized means of distributing these goods was something that is arising with the big store, and new ways of marketing as well too. Something I forgot to mention too, the idea of kinds of fads, fashions, themes was something that Wanamaker's store innovated as well too. That picture there in the middle is a picture of the Egyptian wing. Americans had a kind of fetish with Oriental culture. We're spending money on buying up Eastern originating things in the 1890s, and Wanamaker's is one of the store literally trying to capitalize on that by having this Egyptian wing, this kind of exotic wing that people could go in. It's kind of like the modern day equivalent would be like when Target has a Halloween section in one corner of its store around Halloween time, or a Christmas section. These kind of special sections for people to go in and step out of the already fantasy world of the big store and step into this more exotic world of the Christmas or Halloween world. Wanamaker's and Macy's, Marshall Fields, they're putting all these different things together and pioneering a new form of capitalism, helping Americans, but also helping these increasingly large corporations to answer the question, how are we going to sell all this stuff that we've figured out how to produce now? Just to complete the story of Wanamaker's, you can see that building in the right corner down there is the present day Wanamaker's 24-story building that he moved into in 1912. The picture right above it is a picture of the world's largest pipe organ, which is in Wanamaker's store. If you go to Wanamaker/Macy's today, you will still see that pipe organ. You will still see that kind of open center like that. So you can still be in an incredibly architectural, I don't say marvel, but just a neat place, a neat historic place for shopping. You can still go and enjoy that today. It's really cool around Christmas time, as many of these big stores are. Here's the thing, though. Didn't I say there was a depression on in the 1890s? Yes, there was. The Panic of 1893, which would run to about 1896, 1898. At one point, 20% of Americans are unemployed. The worst depression America had ever experienced in its history is going on in the 1890s. Thousands, tens of thousands of businesses are going out during these years. What's happening with Wanamaker's and Marshall Fields and Macy's? They're seeing increased profits. As Rockefeller said, the survival of the fittest. In depressions, the small go out of business, the big get bigger. This is happening during this time. So Wanamaker's and other big stores are profiting off of the misery of the mom and pops, leading some to go beyond just, calling your Wanamaker's and your Rockefellers, going beyond just calling them robber barons, invoking the language of our revolutionary period, as one shopkeeper would say about the big store. The big store removes much in the matter of independence for men and women in small ways and compels a dependence which, while it might give more money to the fortunate ones, renders them subject to a central power, which in time becomes a tyranny, which will leave no boundless America offering homes for the oppressed. Hyperbole? Overspeak? Or is this just American tradition? What the shopkeeper is saying is, look, the promise of America is not just political independence. The promise of America is economic independence as well, too. It's the promise that everyone through hard work can become not just financially successful, but can become independent, can become their own boss, can own their own store, right? The mom and pop ideal, many, even into the 1890s, considered to be the essence of what it means to be an American, is economic independence. And what this individual is saying is that these big stores and your Standard Oils and these other large corporations increasingly are going to enslave more and more of the American population through closing their stores, closing their smaller businesses, closing their mom and pop shops, and forcing these individuals to go and work for the corporations themselves. So it's not just, what he's complaining here is not so much who's going to make money and who's not. It's who's going to remain economically independent and who is not. And there was a concern that a large population of wage workers, whether it's your white collars or your railroad miners, that large populations, increasingly large populations of people who work for other people, are in fact going to be limited in their upward mobility. They're going to be, as labor organizations began talking about after the Civil War, wage slaves. The shopkeeper is not necessarily going so far as to use this kind of language, but they are kind of hinting at the rise of a large corporate economy in the 1890s means that increasingly Americans are going to have less opportunities for starting businesses and increasingly are going to have to work for someone else. Has history proven this person to be right? Have large corporations destroyed the mom and pop small business and economic independence of Americans? Every time we think that we've reached a place where that is the case, capitalism generates some kind of new, some kind of new opportunity or some kind of new industry where people find, where individuals or families, mom and pop, find opportunities for businesses. So a McDonald's arises and cuts into independently owned restaurants, but then those independent restaurant owners go and start coffee shops. As a new kind of market opportunity, and that's mom and pop. And then Walmart, and then McDonald's says, coffee shops, McCafe. We'll have our own coffee shop here in McDonald's. And then mom and pop says, all right, I'll see your McCafe, and we'll do something that McDonald's doesn't do, like cappuccino or cold brew, or I don't know, something like that. Every time, that a kind of mom and pop store arises and some corporation comes in to kind of take it over, hostily take that idea over, it seems like some kind of new force is generated. So it does seem like capitalism is much more creative in allowing for continued economic independence than maybe this guy is letting on. On the other hand, we do have to recognize since 2000 who are the leading employers in the United States: UPS, McDonald's, and Walmart, all providing for not economic independence, but people who work for a wage for someone else. And so maybe this shopkeeper is both wrong and right about what exactly this new large corporate economy and these big stores, exactly the effect they're going to have on America. Now I got to provide, Wanamaker's defense to this too, because he's being called a robber baron, and he doesn't particularly like it. His response would be, look, these big stores, they're just it's what needed to come. Just like we needed standardization of production, we need standardization of consumption. We're providing a better service, right? Ultimately, businesses should provide social services for the American people. And the better businesses will provide the better service. The big store, what does it do? It provides this one-stop shopping. You don't have to go to 7 shops anymore. You can just come to one place and take care of your shopping needs. You can have a great experience when you do. You can kind of shop at night now, or ride an elevator with your kids, or have a meal in between your shopping now. Socialize, make friends. And you can do this across class lines too, right? We don't have high-end stores and low-end stores. We're just the big store. And so whether you're low class, high class, middle class, you're all welcome to come in this store. And I'm going to try to provide prices that everyone can afford. In other words, Rockefeller's defense for the centralization of distribution, centralization of consumption is it makes for better social service. It's going to make people's lives easier. Yeah, I'm going to make some money off of it, but hey, I'm providing the best social service out there. So, to the victors go the spoils. So there you have it. the big stores and these corporations like Standard Oil and the railroads. The question I leave you with for this part of the lecture is this good or bad for America? The rise of a large corporate private economy without government regulation. Is this good or bad for America? You've kind of seen both sides. You've seen the logics now of your Rockefellers and of your Wanamaker's, why they think this is the way that the country should go, why they think this is best for the country. But you've also seen the people complaining about these robber barons, and you've seen people complaining about these big stores and how they are potentially un-American in the way that Americans fear centralized political power. A lot of Americans at the time said we should fear centralized economic power as well too. We don't seem to care that much about that today. We are worried about big tech, but we're not worried about big tech so much in terms of the money that they make. We're worried about more of issues of free speech and things like that. But it seems we've gotten over our fear of monopoly, so it's worth us as a class going back to a time in which these large corporations are rising for the first times, and Americans are pretty anxious about it. They think that this is not even just dangerous. They think this is even un-American that these Standard Oils and Wanamakers are being allowed to arise. And we'll see in the next, we'll see in the progressivism lecture, Americans of all shapes and sizes are calling upon the government to regulate these large corporations, to save American traditions of economic decentralization, economic opportunity, your mom and pop type economy. Americans are calling upon the government to help restore this economic decentralization as a part of what they consider to be American tradition. But again, for a decade which seemed like America was heading towards Armageddon, irrepressible conflicts it seemed between working classes and the upper classes, understand that Americans are being connected to each other, not just through the products that they buy, but how they're buying those products. Things that we take for granted today, forces that connect us today, not just the products we consume, but how and where we purchase those products, and the experiences that we have along the way of securing those products. It's worth us thinking about how Americans are so much more interconnected. The word in the next lecture will be interdependent than we were in the years before the Civil War. And this large corporate economy is literally incorporating Americans in ways that had not been experienced before. And as we can see, maybe for good and ill. So as you begin thinking about, well, what kinds of observations am I going to be putting together for my exam? What am I going to do with this topic on corporations? You might just answer the question. I believe the rise of large corporations and big stores were good for America. I believe the rise of large corporations and big stores were bad for America. And so you already kind of get a start with just being able to kind of think your way through these kinds of questions in light of how this centralization of the economy and centralization of consumption, how that has played out in your own lifetime. All right, so this is part one. We will continue with our theme of incorporation in part two. See you in a minute.